Hi, everyone. It's such a nice room. Nice people. It's great. I have no visuals, I'm sorry. Over the last few years, I've been working on a group of projects on my own with a collective of researchers that address problems of musical enclosure. I mean here that my focus has been on the relationship between elements of music held in common and the methods by which institutional forms like copyright, intellectual property, disciplinary, authorship, and museums create infrastructures for enclosing and dispossessing communities and individuals of their musics through the invention of enclosed, dispossessive, or proprietary methods of claim. When I saw this conference's call for papers, I was extremely excited about the possibility to think about how lines of enclosure have been demarcated within and adjacent to music studies. In the last 3 years, I've felt constantly drawn to scholarship that troubled my own prior assumptions about working interdisciplinarily. Particularly coming from scholars in Black studies and my collaborators in Indigenous studies, I've been constantly engaging in scholarship that I read is fundamentally about music, but that I have a hard time reconciling as fitting within the disciplinary heart of the various musicologies. In thinking about histories of commoning, lines of enclosure, fences, hedges, and walls, copyright, authorship, and museum displays, and of land as understood through First Nations philosophies of grounded normativity, I find myself concerned for how this kind of work could ever possibly not be musicological, while maintaining a clear institutional and disciplinary sense that something notably different is happening here. It makes me feel simultaneously frustrated with my own field while eager to defend from our particular forms of reach and enclosure the forms of writing that emerge in that work. That is, in thinking through enclosure and dispossession, I feel more convinced than ever that all gestures of inclusion and drawing in are not necessarily benevolent or positive, and that music can in fact do negative work. My interest today is thus to narrate in brief my relationship to some of this work, to catalog how and what I've been reading, while keeping closely in mind why I am not arguing for its inclusion or recognition within a musicological paradigm, but rather the importance of recognizing, first, its existence right at our borders, and second, the terms on which it remains just outside. Against any effort to impose a singular narrative on this work or to take an extractivist approach to a concept that might provide value for music studies, my attention has been focused primarily on a kind of musical poetics that takes place outside of our subfields through how scholars in Black and Indigenous studies, working very closely on music, rhetorically position and indeed address music in their writing. In keeping with resisting enclosure and in pursuit of imagining musical discourse as drawing upon a resource potentially held in common, I've taken up this reading as an ethico-relational practice of recognizing the ongoing fullness and extensive presence of conversation on and knowledge about music. I'm worried that all this may sound pretty hokey or obvious, and that as a white settler scholar, I might still risk sounding desperate to appropriate this work. But I hope there's still some insight to be found here. Drawing in particular on Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's 2013 book, The Undercommons, I've come to think of this area outside of music studies as, to borrow their words, music study. What characterizes study for Moten and Harney is precisely this constant ongoingness, or to borrow words from my friend Dan DiPiero's music-adjacent writing, study is a synonym for love, in the sense of loving something enough to dedicate spending lots of time with it. To paraphrase Moten and Harney again, I've tried to use this reading project to remind myself that in my teaching and writing, I'm not so much starting new conversations as nearly always interrupting conversations about music that are already in progress everywhere among friends and colleagues, students, and strangers. In trying to think about music as held in common, I want to avoid falling back onto anything that might sound like a universal language type line of thought. Instead, I'm using music held in common to try to think through methods and measures of enclosure so that I can then take a few steps back to recall what had been prior to that wall or fence or whatever else, that line being erected. Reading into Euro-American histories of commoning has been valuable here, though rarely explicitly musical. Prominent work by Sylvia Federici or Peter Leinbach comes to mind, as well as key sources for them like Marx's writing on primitive accumulation, or E.P. Thompson's and Christopher Hill's leftist histories of English working class and Loveism. The Montreal historian Alan Greer recently published a comparative study of property and dispossession in North America that made the argument that much of the dispossession of America by European settlers occurred not through private property, but through settler commons, pasturing and grazing lands that sought to replicate the fields and meadowed commons that early white settlers brought with them in their hearts from England, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, and France as part of conventional land use. From this writing, it becomes clear that even commoning has its dispossessive dimensions, its potential to be made exclusionary within the settler colonial mindset. Landed and musical conceptions of property are nevertheless not always as separate as we might imagine. In reading adjacent to music studies, music often appears in strange places. The first land survey to ever be completed of an entire naturally enclosed region was of the island of Ireland. The survey was completed in the 1650s by soldiers who served in Oliver Cromwell's recent vicious campaign in Ireland. Cited by Adam Smith and others as the innovator of a division of labor into discrete tasks, William Petty directed those thousands of troops in creating instruments, measuring out lots, inscribing maps, collecting data, and so on. The promise was that soldiers who participated in the survey work would be given a plot of land when it was complete, and thus that the war would also pay for itself. The enclosure of Ireland was called the Down Survey because it was put down on paper. Dozens of surveyors never got their pay as they were murdered by Irish folks defending their land from enclosure. When Petty took up the position, he had just left his role as professor of music at Gresham College in 1650-51. As payment, he received 30,000 acres of Irish land. Dylan Robinson and I recently co-wrote an essay titled The Feeling of Knowing Music, in which we tried to think about how the proprietary claims that music studies scholars make on music can sometimes risk alienating those who intimately know and love music, but don't necessarily recognize that music in our disciplinary writing styles. In that essay, Dylan and I turned to writing about music guides to find language that expresses the musicological anxiety that amateur music lovers might come to feel entitled to write about music without a musicologist's guidance. Jonathan Bellman is most explicit here. He writes, quote, "Because most people love music, writers tend to assume they can write about it on a technical level for which they are manifestly unequipped. One can maintain a lifetime's interest in music with a long history of concert attendance and a large collection of recordings, perhaps even singing in a church or community choir and playing in folk or popular music groups, and still have no musical literacy," end quote. Around the same time that Bellman was writing, in 2006, Ian Biddle noted that Guido Adler's foundational delineation of musicology necessarily required what Biddle described as wresting the study of music from the amateur, from that lover of music, the hopeless enthusiast, end quote. In our essay, Dylan and I wrote in response, amateurs are not a threat to musicology because they do not know music. They are a threat because they know it all too well, and thus their form of knowing must be dispossessed and reconstructed as wrong. Music studies, discursively and pedagogically, begins not by building a new epistemological structure, but from clearing the land of its inhabitants, by knowing in music a mode of listening that informs amateurs why they should not be there. The essay with Robinson grew out of the earlier phases of a collaborative project we're still working on now together called Caring for Our Ancestors. The project examines protocols of care and reconnection with Indigenous song life incarcerated in museums. The research team includes about 10 artists and scholars, each of whom has a more and less direct disciplinary connection with music, though at least when we began the project, none of us was working in a music department. Dylan and I were in cultural studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. The Hopi scholar Trevor Reed is a composer and ethnomusicologist, but who works in the faculty of law. Robin Gray is a Tsimshian sociologist whose work and writing have frequently centered on the rematriation of her community's song life as contained in wax cylinders. Peter Morin is a Tahltan performance artist working in an arts and design university, whose practice, though, very often centers around music and song, as in his recent karaoke LP, Love Songs to End Colonization. While Trevor, Robin, and the Haudenosaunee PhD student Sebastian DeLine are each involved in specific repatriation projects at any given time, our research collective is framed more as an opportunity to think about relationships and care, institutions and incarceration, in a collective and multidisciplinary setting, including with white settler allies, including myself and the filmmaker Nevin Lockhead. Due to COVID limitations, our first 3 years were spent reading together on Zoom on a monthly basis. Most often these were work in progress drafts from members of the research team, but we also invited guests. One that particularly impacted me was the Black Studies scholar and geographer Catherine McKittrick, whose then recent book, Dear Science, speaks almost constantly about music. I was floored by the book then, as I am now. It's beautifully written and plays very productively with citational style and the creative potential of footnote infrastructures. But most importantly for me, it was once again a book very deeply engaging music and in critique of the lines that carve up disciplines. It felt, reading her work, like she was laying bare the incredible amount of work, research, writing, citation, and discourse required to uphold disciplinary boundaries. That is, they are not walls that once put up remain in place. They're more like a constantly policed border, requiring labor, power, resources, time, and energy to maintain. Indeed, it felt as if those two elements were closely interrelated, and I asked Catherine about the relationship of music to dissolving the lines that separate our fields. Catherine's answer was wonderful. She said she cares deeply about music and noted that she has always been most inspired by work that grows out of the long tradition in Black studies of closely engaging music as a mode of thought. She pointed me to Clyde Woods' wonderful book, Development Arrested, about the geography of the Mississippi Delta, but whose method is a blues epistemology that constantly calls up and defers to situated, localized, grounded references to Delta blues song. She mentioned the well-known work of a frequent collaborator, Alexander Weheliye, and Richard Eiton's In Search of the Black Fantastic. We talked as well about Fred Moten's scholarship, poetry, and recently his music, both on his own and in his work in frequent collaboration with Stefano Harney. To these, we could have added books she didn't mention, like Aishan Crowley's important work, Trisha Rose's hip hop book that has very much been taken on in music studies, as far as I can tell, or DeForest Brown Jr.'s recent book, Assembling a Black Counterculture on Detroit Techno. McKittrick could also have pointed her to her extensive work on Sylvia Wynter. The two of them write together, quote, "Music, then, is not only an invention that subverts and undoes common sense workings of racism, music making and music listening together demonstrate the subversive politics of shared stories, communal activities, and collaborative possibilities wherein one must participate in knowing," end quote. I suppose what I mean to flag as important here is that there are many Black and Indigenous scholars working in critical topics on music, but most often they develop their careers wherein it made more sense to examine that music in the context of departments dedicated to anything seemingly but the study of music. Geographers, poets, literary scholars, sociologists, law professors, filmmakers, performance artists, and scholars in Black, Indigenous, American, gender, cultural, on and on studies. And it might sound trite or silly, but I get the sense more and more as I read in this work that what we might be missing cannot be turned into a singular or innovative concept to bring into music studies, but might relate simply to the way that music is addressed in their work, the epistemological understanding of music in play across it. In our essay, Dylan and I called these different feelings of knowing music. But I think most conversationally, we can just say that where music scholarship has often addressed music as an object to study or master or enclose or delimit, scholars in other fields, much like music fans in general, address music with something like love or care. And indeed, love is a recurring theme in much of the non-musicological literature I've cited. Music serves here as a kind of agglutinating, relational practice of thoughtful care work. Tying music into love does not make it uncritical, but often places on the same register as literature, poetry, art, and interpersonal relation. On his recent album, Moten, with the drummer Brendan Lopez and the bassist Gerald Cleaver, Fred Moten begins by intoning, "Art don't work for abolition, art works for bosses like you and me. If let's abolish art sounds too close to let's abolish you and me, it's because it is. I love art and I love you too, and this is a love song, so it's got to be too close." Richard Eiton, in an essay that includes close readings of love songs by Chic, Fela Kuti, Funkadelic, and Miss Lecter, among others, might respond, quote, "The love song in the post-colonial, post-civil rights context, with its explicitly gendered impulses, can be seen as one of the more familiar and available sites for the imagination of Black political possibilities." End quote. Love, care, relationship, and collectivity are very important in this context. Stefano Harney asks, quote, "What if music is the solvent that can dissolve the objective of individuation?" End quote. That is, what if music is the thing that can teach us to stop from dividing things up, whether you or me, or land or property, or disciplinary obligations in general? Two Indigenous writers played up similar concerns in the liner notes to Moren's collaborative record with the settler-songwriter Shotgun Jimmy. On the back of Love Songs to End Colonization, we read, quote, "Singing together is an intimate place to share love, hurt, and laughter, as much as collectively acknowledge the power of song," from the multimedia artist Kevin Aichi DeForest. The artist Tanya Willard zones in on Moren's now rather famous laughter, which has been written about a lot, Peter's laugh. Writing, quote, "To experience these works fully, you need to imagine loud laughs, the church of karaoke sacrament, end quote. It recalls for me the frequency of laughter in our research collective, which led one member to propose that we write a methodology that centers laughter as a marker of scholarly rigor. Black studies scholarship has a strong legacy of recognizing the relationship between enclosure and dispossession, or the difference between love and disciplinarity. I had never seen a song used so forcefully as a substantive piece of evidence, as when McKittrick in Dear Science writes as a full sentence, quote, "Discipline is empire, period," with a footnote that then says, "Listen to Jimmy Cliff, Many Rivers to Cross," from the album The Harder They Come, Island Records, 1972. So she cites the claim "Discipline is empire" just to a Jimmy Cliff song, full stop. She does this often. In her essay on Jimi Hendrix, the first footnote reads, "To assist with my readings of music histories, biographies, sounds, and theories, I have been engaging the following thinkers," and there's a long list here: Richard Eiton, Clyde Woods, Leroy Jones, Mark Campbell, Jacques Attali, Edouard Glissant, Paul Gilroy, Fred Moten, Sylvia Winter, Robin D.G. Kelly, Lawrence Levine, Angela Davis, Alexander Weheliye, Oliver Sacks, Vijay Iyer, Daniel Levitin, Nina Simone, Betty Davis, Funkadelic, Drexcia, Kanye West, Erykah Badu, Jimmy Cliff, and Michael Jackson. That's kind of the first, I think, one of the only footnotes in that essay. Not only Betty Davis and Nina Simone, but also the collective Drexcia are registered as thinkers alongside Attali, Glissant, Gilroy, and Moten. Moreover, the work of listening is constitutive up to the point of citation up front of how she came to her ideas. But I think the last word here should be given to Moten and Harney again. The work of the political theorist Cedric Robinson is a key reference point for both of them. Robinson never seems to have commented directly on music, but Moten and Harney have taken up his ideas on order as central to their understanding of both an undercommons and the idea of study. Study, Moten and Harney, via Robinson insists, is always ongoing. It's one of the dangers of the university to them that it positions itself as the place where study happens. Instead, they insist that study happens everywhere. They teach us that when a professor walks into the room, quelling the noise and proposing to begin the class, they are in fact interrupting ongoing study. Much as we often do in the musicologies, Moten and Harney latch onto this form, this idea of study from Robinson's terms of order, to then read a piece of music. In the conversation that closes the undercommons, Harney says, quote, "Fred and I have talked about this by thinking about a certain kind of song, a soul song that you might get in Curtis Mayfield or in Marvin Gaye, where something's going on. Let's call it the experiment with the general antagonism. And then the song starts. You can hear the audience, you can hear the crowd, and then he begins to sing, or music begins to start. So the thing that I'm interested in is, without calling something to order, how do you still start to sing?" To which Moten responds, this is kind of a long quote, quote, "Form is not the eradication of the informal. Form is what emerges from the informal." So the classic example of that kind of song is What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. And of course, the title is already letting you know, God damn it, something's going on. This song emerges out of the fact that something already was going on. Then from a certain limited perspective, we recognize there are these people milling around and talking and greeting one another. And then something that we recognize as music emerges from that. But then if you think about it for half a damn second, you say, but the music was already playing. Music was already being made. So what emerges is not music in some general way as opposed to the non-musical. What emerges as a form, as something that we call informality. The informal is not the absence of form, it's the thing that gives form. The informal is not formlessness. And what those folks are engaging in at the beginning of What's Going On is study. Now, when Marvin Gaye starts singing, that's study too. It's not that study that emerges, it's not that study that emerges out of the absence of study, it's a continuing extension of that study. End quote, as the long Moten quote. From then, the opening party scene in What's Going On, and this is very important to me because this is one of the key things that came up in the gay estates argument with Robin Thicke in 2015 for Blurred Lines. Testifies to the fact that song and music emerge out of ongoing study, what they generally call the general antagonism, which I think is a very good term. There are, of course, precedents in music studies for the emergence of music out of daily life. It's a central theme in many good ethnographies, as the voice frequently crosses the boundary between speech and song. I think of people like Josh Pilzer and Emily Wong and others. But what's more important to me here is this idea of ongoingness and the reminder that study is always happening. It's why music study has become an important term to me, because it reminds me of the unexceptionality in some senses of our field. Not that there isn't exceptional work, exceptional people, a beautiful literature, and a remarkable body of ideas and analyses. But I feel compelled now to remind myself in my research and in my teaching that everybody knows and loves music, that scholars outside our field are actively and critically offering vital perspectives on it, and that every time I walk into my classroom, I'm not turning the conversation towards music as a means of introducing my students to something new, but more likely interrupting a conversation on music already in progress, to divide up and claim as my own terrain that ongoing and undercommon field of study. Thank you.
Any questions? I mean, I wouldn't mind starting out with just a couple of comments. There's a really terrific succession of ideas, and I was thinking about two things. One is how your idea of enclosure, and enclosed dialogue and enclosed conversation, musicological conversation, is part of our, continuing obsession with cultural capital and continuing obsession with Bourdieu's idea that we still live in a world in which we feel this privilege of being able to express comments that can easily just be understood by the 20 people in this room, and that kind of enclosure continues to manifest itself in most of our study. I mean, that's probably a statement, but
The question, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I guess what I've been thinking of in terms of kind of thinking about like the idea of commons and commoning, I think it always sounds so nostalgic or kind of like uncritical or pre-critical or something. So you think of commons as like floral, meadows and where everything's fine or whatever. Like that's what I keep thinking of is the idea that if our kind of cultural capital derives from that kind of exclusivity, that there might be methods of redirecting or adding to the conversation in such a way that the actual infinite presence of music everywhere all the time. I'm always especially thinking of our students, that you walk into a music classroom. I teach a lot of non-majors, which I really enjoy. Yeah. And the wealth of knowledge on music in that classroom is stunning. And it's when it's not enclosed in that way. So I mean, I'm not a giant lover of Bourdieu in general either. It's maybe so I guess I'm thinking, of ways of seeing things that are held in common as you can never kind of remove those, barriers to access and equality and availability, but that there is something to music as a cultural discourse, in fact, that is common, and that maybe there's a version of music studies that is enlivened by that rather than intimidated by it.
The other thing I was going to ask is, I really like your idea about policing boundaries and how much scholarly effort, and you didn't mention the word power, but how much power it takes to police those boundaries, and that we continue to exert so much effort, in this, and so much money, and so much time, and so much kind of constricted conversation to police these boundaries of where we are, whether the musicological records of performance even. Yeah, it takes work. But what? No, but I like the idea of what are those power structures that you see that are
I mean, I'm very new to a department with Julia and with others at the University of Alberta, where I feel like people are very open to what I've been thinking in this direction. I suppose too, there's always the gain of hopefully more non-majors, and so there are benefits to the school and to the kind of the department's power in that sense, I suppose too. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I think in case of the essay that Dylan and I wrote, Dylan was kind of writing that music diet is maybe almost unfair. They're really trying to insist that you not try to write about music unless you've taken a music class, and you have to really explicit in terms of that.
Because the irony is that, for example, at BU we have this maybe it's 4 or 5 years old now, a new general education program, which was to replace the usual gen ed idea of what it was, and it originally was supposed to be that this was going to be a very wide-ranging general education curriculum that comes out of faculty interests rather than in some sort of disciplinary idea. But in the end, it's just what it takes is an enormous amount of administrative policing to make this even work. And how the whole thing is structured, and how you construct a syllabus, and how you're supposed to propose things. It goes through 17 layers of administration for a single course, and I start laughing, about these great platitudes about freedom of expression and moving beyond disciplines, in the sense of all we're doing is putting more effort into policing our territory.
Yeah. Have you read the Undercommons, the Moten and Harney book?
No.
It's a good read. If anyone has it's subtitled something like Fugitive Planning and Black Study, but a lot of it's about universities, and they kind of start by talking about what the goals of an academic career are. If it's full course really from a research center and whatever that then if that's the case, then the whole goal is to escape study. Then your job is to get further and further and further from study.
Mike.
Sure. Thanks so much. What a perfect way to open this conference. I'm really glad that Kismet happened. I want to ask, so I'm really struck by the idea of study as love. I mean, it reminds me of Robin D.G. Kelly's, right? Study, love, organize, because if you study, you love, and if you love, then you're worried about inequity and you fight against it, right? Those things are together. And what I wanted to ask you actually kind of follows up on both the last point that Victor made and the last response that you made with reference to Moten and Stefano, what's his last name? I don't know.
Harney.
Yes, Harney. Which is, what is the role if sort of the idea of study is not against a backdrop of sort of non-study, right? That there's a kind of when the song has already begun, once the sax comes in for what's going on, then what specifically is the place of the university, right? Like as an institution, given the bureaucratization of some of these processes that Victor's talking about, what distinguishes the university from other places as an institution, and what should happen there in order to actually sort of reflect or model, like what if everything is already sort of imminent, then what is the kind of value added of having these particular types of institutions? I think maybe a little bit hopefully that there is a place for the university as a place for doing a particular type of study, and the fact that it seems that universities are very much certainly in the United States, I'm not sure here in the UK or in Canada, but it seems that universities are, I don't know if under threat, well, actually under threat, if we include sort of economic stuff and all of that, as well as particular types of rhetoric, that these spaces are under threat. So how do we kind of square that circle? Assuming that you agree with me on both of those points.
Yeah, for sure. I can give the first kind of pithy Moten and Harney answer, because they say that all university is useful for is that it's an incredible gathering of resources. And that's kind of their take on it.
Yeah.
But I mean, to me, I love universities. Like, I've been in universities my whole life now, it feels like. And I feel like, to me, the thing is, engagement with students and engagement with people and the capacity to read and write all day for a living. But I guess I feel like when those kind of conversations around economic things come up, and I'm still, again, just learning my own institutions, relation to these kind of things, but I feel like once that economic things comes up, that it comes down to, is that the university? Is the people who are cutting the funding the university? And is the people who are putting it under threat, even if they are in the university, are they of the university in some sense? And so I don't know, is there something just like doubling down that we all do, or on what we do? And I always find funny too, things like applying for like grants. There's just these massive pots of money to apply for in Canada, and I don't know much what to do with a ton of money, but then you can't use them to like buy out course time to have some time. And so, I don't know, I think it seems funny to me to think of ways to use a lot of money for those kind of things, but that's what the currency is, I suppose, of doing well there and of doing your job. And I enjoy that, I appreciate that, but I think those kind of money things, I wonder if there's a way to view them as kind of separate or not my problem or something.
If I could just push back for a second, it seems that certainly private universities, there's not only a gathering of resources, there's also an extraction of resources, right?
Public ones too.
Yeah, and
land grant schools especially.
Right, yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, all that stuff too.
We have about 2 minutes, yes.
Well, I was just thinking about the University of Alberta, because you're there now, just as an example. And I really love the description of the thinking and the intellectual activity going on before you begin I'm never going to think about my classroom in the same way. But I'm thinking about, for instance, the moment when I'm teaching, or you're teaching a class, where the majority of the students are people who've gone through music training through the Royal College of Music, who've done private lessons at great expense, and then the person who comes, because the University of Alberta is a land grant university meant to serve people throughout the entire province, from like a very small place, Hinton, outside on the at the foothills of the mountains, and comes in, and the engagement, the mismatch in some ways of those, and the attempt to kind of extend access so that the girl from Hinton's ideas are there. But then also I was thinking about I've been working on the work of Weheliye Qureshi, who's in a South Asian community, and also been working with archives that are actually belong to Indigenous communities and the different experiences of the university by these two people. So for instance, South Asian people are very comfortable in the university because the university is one of the very first places that conferred prestige on this new vulnerable group of people. So I'm thinking of Salim Qureshi, Weheliye Qureshi's husband, who became a professor there in the 1960s. And so the university is seen by the South Asian diaspora community as being a very natural place to be in, which allowed for, for access to intellectual vistas, to improving their job, to improving the health of the family, etc. But for Indigenous people, the idea of them coming to the university, which excluded them until the 1950s, to engage with an archive, I was told that even now, it would be a very hostile thing to expect to see somebody to come in to look at their incarcerated music in the basement of the university. So I think that we really have to understand how a university feels to, the kid from the foothills of the Alberta mountains, to an Indigenous person. We have to be very specific to understand, to better understand what this question would look like.
Yeah, I think that was kind of, to me, where a lot of this kind of research and thinking began, was trying to figure out, like, why is it so hard to get Indigenous students in the music programs in Canada? And you can start listing dozens of reasons that are very easy to target and locate. But then what do you do with all of the really fascinating work that people like Trevor and Robin are doing, who decided not to do music degrees because music was a hostile place for Indigenous person to go, but sociology was manageable, law was manageable, whatever. So I guess, again, that's kind of maybe my extractivist moment there too, is thinking, what insights in music can you glean from these non-musicological topics that allow you to, because even too, I think then, talking about Trevor and Robin makes more space for Indigenous students in music, maybe eventually. But I don't know how an Indigenous high school student is going to find those articles, but it goes and goes.
Can I ask you what I
go
think will be a quick question? Yeah, I'll try to be fast. When you were talking about the alienation certain groups can feel from reading scholarship, I was struck by you say a kind of musical literacy, and literacy, like the sort of L word of like, what is the alternative when literate ways of expressing oneself are so highly valued in disciplines such as musicology, like basically in universities, right? Like, what do we do? How do we have discourse outside of that in ways that are recognized and valued by those institutions? Are we imagining literacy as like score reading, you mean, or literacy? Well, I was curious how you were using it in that way too.
I think I only said literacy in the Bellman quote, where he said all the kind of things you could have done through a career, through a life in music, but not have acquired any musical literacy. So I think he meant specifically you could, I mean, he said, mentioned, singing in choirs. He mentioned, I think he means you can read music even and still be musically illiterate. I don't know what to make of that. Yeah. That's troubling. Did I answer the question? I don't know if I'm targeting the thing you're trying to point out. Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to teach classes that don't rely on scores. I do mostly that, yeah, right now at least. I now can't wait for my history survey to like do a score hardcore. Like I've at least no scores the last several years. So yeah. Thank you. Curious to discuss that more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.